Excellent. So we should be live, and I see that already some people waiting in the room before our live stream begins wrote into the chat. That's excellent. So welcome everyone. It is really my pleasure to see you all here on the webinar, which is called Stop Chat Control: Why Scanning All Our Private Messages is a Very Bad Idea. So I am Markéta Gregorova. I am a member of the European Parliament and I represent Pirates. And I work on this proposal as a shadow rapporteur for the Green CIFA political group in the European Parliament, which basically means that I am one of the negotiators with the power and responsibility to shape and deal with this legislation. So what are we talking about today? The proposal that we call chat control was tabled by the Commission back in May 2022, and it would allow authorities to require providers of digital services to scan private emails, clouds, messages, images, and URLs, even in end-to-end encrypted apps like Signal, in order to search for child sexual abuse material. And so that is why today I wanted to discuss this proposal, why I believe, and my expert panel, that it is wrong and what we can do about it. And I have invited four, I think, really leading experts on this issue so that together we can unpack what chat control really means, explain why it is such a threat to privacy and security, and most importantly, talk about how we can stop it. So let's begin. And I would first like to give the floor to our speakers to introduce themselves. Then we will begin our discussion. I will give our speakers several questions, sort of to warm up and to explain to you what's it about. But also because of high interest in this webinar, I will try to give as many of you, our participants, space to ask questions. But please know that probably it will not be possible to get to everyone. So think about it thoroughly and write it into the chat. And now, of course, my dear guests, if we can make a quick round and maybe start with Carmela, if you can introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi, I'm Carmela Troncoso. I'm a scientific director at the Max Planck Institute for Security and Privacy, and I have more than 10 years of experience analyzing and designing privacy technologies.
Thank you for accepting the invitation and joining us. Then if I might ask Joachim.
Yes, hello. Thank you for having me. My name is Joachim, and I'm the creator of the Fight Chat Control website, which, for those of you who do not know, is a one-stop website that does primarily two things. It provides an overview of how the different member states are currently leaning on chat control, as well as an overview of the stances of all the individual MEPs. And secondly, it allows visitors to easily find and contact their elected representatives, officials, to express what they think about the chat control legislation. I'm very happy to be part of tonight's webinar, and I look forward to the discussions. Thank you.
Also, thank you for joining and accepting the invitation and for all the hard work on fighting chat control with your initiative. Then if I may ask Udbhav Tiwari for your introduction.
Hi, I'm Udbhav Tiwari, and I'm the VP for Strategy and Global Affairs at Signal, the messaging application. I have over a decade of experience working in the technology sector and largely in the nonprofit technology sector, helping defend the open internet from threats from privacy and security. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you for joining us, and thanks Signal for their statements about leaving the EU market if chat control was put in place. We really appreciate it. That's part of the pressure. And last but not least, if I may ask Asha Ellen. Thank you.
Hello, good evening. Thank you so much for the invitation to join. My name is Asha Allen. I'm the Secretary General and Director for the Centre for Democracy and Technology Europe. We're a not-for-profit organisation that advocates for fundamental rights protection in EU tech policy. And alongside our sister organisation, CDTUS, we've been established now for more than 30 years, fighting for key issues, whether that's online expression, but also against mass surveillance and the protection of encryption. So we're very happy to be part of this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us. Before we begin, just a reminder again, if the participants, the listeners, if you have any questions, please write them into the chat and I will then ask the speakers for you on your behalf. And with this being said, I will start asking the speakers. I would like to maybe start with, and by the way, this should be like a conversation. So I will ask certain people, but if you feel like you have something more to add, please somehow tell me and definitely feel free to take the floor. And I was thinking of the first direction, asking Carmela, and maybe with some addition from Asha, on the detection technologies and types of content. Like, what are we dealing with when the Parliament, the Commission, and Council are taking different approaches to what type of content needs to be detected? You know, the Commission allowed to detect almost all types of content, while the Council and also the Parliament takes like a more cautious stance on grooming and the new child sexual abuse material. And I would like to know more technologically, because, you know, in the end, of course, we are talking about scanning everything, but of course, taking out always just a certain thing, whatever we decided it is. Can you explain what are the different types of detection technologies for each material? And I'm talking both about the like images or URLs, maybe even AI models, and how reliable are all of these detection technologies? What is the amount of false positives? You know, where is their reliability coming from? And yeah, I'll start with that. Maybe we'll broaden up the discussion. So maybe Carmela, if you want to start.
So when we're talking about detecting CSAM, we can first think about two possibilities. Either we're trying to find something we know what it is, or something we don't know what it is. When we're talking about something we don't know what it is, we need to go to machine learning models, where we have a model that will have learned patterns that are the patterns that the kind of content we're looking for. And this would work for URLs, for images, for audio, for text, patterns that we know they are related to this. And then we will give it an input, an image, a piece of text, a piece of audio, and then this machine learning model will say yes or no. And these models are not, I mean, they are very far from perfect. Then we can try to find known CSAM, something that we already know what it is, and we can try to actually find the exact same material that we saw before, right? So like an image and then the exact copy of the image, and we could do that with what we call a hash function. That is a perfect summary of the image. And if we find the same hash function, then we could say we actually have found the image that we have seen before. And this mostly works for images, not really for the rest. And then the third thing, which is the most common one in the case of CSAM, is when we have a modified version of something we know. So we take an image and then we rotate it, we crop it, we compress it. So the representation in bits changes. And there is a technology called perceptual hashing that actually allows us to find, kind of very similar things. So hashes would have to be the exact same copy. A perceptual hash allows you to move left to right. And this again is starting to be not so effective. Like if we have a hash, then we know that we found something that we have perfect certainty is the same. If you have a perceptual hashing, errors start to be common. But the other thing to take into account is that also both perception hashing and machine learning models are extremely easy to evade. And what I mean by this is that if because how images are, so images have a lot of pixels, or text or audio has a lot of bits. If we modify 2 or 3 bits, then these patterns that we were looking for can be modified in such a way that the detector will not anymore know that this is CSAM, while we only change few bits. So for the human perception, the photo stays the same, the audio stays the same. And for links, I mean, as we know, most of you probably have always used a tiny URL or something that just allows you to redirect your link and kind of create a new link every single time. So detectors are not very reliable because they are very, very easy with not much knowledge to actually bypass.
Yes, thank you. There are already some questions in the chat, and maybe I will already direct one at you. And this is the first one. What are the estimated costs of implementing such a technology? I know you might not have the numbers, but like, would the costs be high?
I think that the costs are pretty high. I mean, the costs, you have to have the model, you have to train the models, you have to collect the data, and then implement this on all applications, right? So I think the costs are pretty high. But again, the cost, we don't have to only think about the costs of implementing it and putting this detector, which can cost money, but maybe it's not kind of outrageous also because you will deploy the same technology in many places. But the real cost of this technology is that once we detect something, okay, this is going to be sent to law enforcement. And then law enforcement has to check that this is actually a false positive. And now, sorry, that is actually a true positive. Now, imagine all of your messages that we are going to have in Europe and all the time that this thing is going to be sent. We're going to have thousands of personnel across Europe actually checking all the time this thing. Now, the cost of deploying all those people, that is extremely high. And you're going to have these thousands of people if you want to handle the amount of messages that they're going to be detected, because as I said, these technologies are far from perfect. So you always have to have a human on the other side checking, was this correct or not?
Yes, absolutely. I think that more people added to this in the chat that if we consider storing, data on some servers of 450 million individuals, then we are really reaching very high ceilings of the potential costs. I don't know if somebody wants to add on that, maybe some data, but no, it's okay. Yeah, sorry.
No, I'll be happy to come in like very quickly on that, which is to also say, I think it's important we recognize that the economic costs of these measures are not just economic costs of their deployment and of their enforcement, but also economic costs that arise from what happens once these measures are actually available on every device that is ostensibly operating in the European Union. We've already seen within the debate, law enforcement agencies and intelligence agencies have reacted to most criticism of the fact that this is like introducing a vulnerability on your system by saying we will exempt them from government devices. And as you can imagine, if an intelligence agency wants to make sure that its servers and services don't have this technology, the C-suite of a multi-billion-dollar company probably doesn't want its C-suite to be susceptible to the same risks as well. So downstream, after these things are actually made available, I think we will see very interesting and pretty severe impacts on what kinds of technology people are willing to put on what systems and how they share and communicate with them. So just as a simple example, if I have a device that even as a government person, I think can have client-side scanning turned off, ostensibly under these measures, just think of the time that I will have to function on having another device that is government and another device that is personal. And that personal device being the place where I can't bring any sensitive information because the client-side scanning system will end up scanning the content on that. And I don't want to take the risk of security that we can get to a little later as well. And it's those downstream effects that I think are like quite impactful. There's some really good research by the Internet Society that I think was commissioned towards the late 2021, early 2022, that specifically looks at the TOLA law, which is the technical access law that is actually present in Australia, and just takes Australia as an economy and approximates what the consequence will be of measures that weaken encryption. And the numbers are in the billions of Australian dollars, which are billions of euros as well.
Yes, thank you for mentioning it. Our host can, of course, if they have it, post the link to the chat. And if I may stay with you, Utpaf, and ask maybe about the impact on cybersecurity. I will start with an example. In 2024, it was revealed that Chinese actors were able to hack into the main US telecom providers through the backdoor provided by these telecom companies to court-authorized wiretapping, which is sort of similar to what the CSAM material, the chat control proposal, wants to do, sort of also court authorized wiretapping, but of online communications. And I would like to ask you, given that Signal is end-to-end encrypted, how dangerous do you think that CSAM would be for security of end-to-end encrypted communications? And do you think, well, you sort of mentioned it, that the fact that the council wants to exempt their own security services is a proof of their awareness of the cybersecurity issues? And does it represent a threat to citizens? So if you may.
Thank you. For Signal, this is an existential catastrophic risk for providing our services in the European Union. Very simply put, the idea that a device will scan content before it is encrypted for us negates the very purpose of encryption. If everything that you have to say before it is sent on Signal has to be scanned by your device to determine whether it is legal or illegal, we believe we are crossing a Rubicon into effectively thought crime. Because what you are being censored on is the fact that you have this thought and opinion, and the scanning is the censorship. We also believe that the capabilities that these technologies represent, and there was actually a paper that was shared in the public chat as well around, I think it says if you want to know more about this topic, check out the journal article below called Bugs in Our Pockets, that does a really good job, I believe, of showcasing what are the different ways in which this system can be compromised. Very quickly, it's everything from the training data on which these systems are trained, the functioning of the models that will perform the scanning itself, the reporting mechanisms and the way that they can be leveraged to unfairly target individuals, all have massive glaring vulnerabilities just because of how software development works as a concept or as a principle. Whether I poison a CSAM, imagine I take a CSAM image and I poison it in a manner that I report it into the database that organizations create for CSAM imagery, and then that is used to train a model. What that will mean is that after that poisoning attack, I can make the model, if I engineer my vulnerabilities well, do things that I want with regard to the device and to the kind of content that it is scanning, simply by compromising the training data, and it will only be discovered when I use it as a one-time vulnerability. If you look at most of the analogies between targeted spyware, like if you were to tell me that there's a thing that will be in your device that will scan what's on your device and determine whether it is legal or not, apart from the legal bit, that's exactly how malware works today, which is the idea that it compromises your device in order to gain access to information and then make that information available to malicious actors. And malicious actors will start using this capability to gain access that would simply be unthinkable for them under the current security paradigms of how operating systems have been implemented. There is also, I think, a very real risk we need to talk about centralization and consolidation from a competition sense. The reality is, independent of what the law says, there are going to be very few vendors in the world that will build this technology. Some of them are going to be operating system vendors, and it's going to be implemented in a device level where we will have very little choice to say, is this okay? Yes, we want to do it, or is it not okay? And we've already seen in the past that when these vendors deploy these services, Microsoft, for example, offers photo DNA technology today for scanning content on the server side. I would encourage you to try to get access to the photo DNA tool, even as a member of parliament or as a technology expert or as a journalist. It is borderline impossible to gain access to that tool because they know that there are so many ways in which it can be compromised, and they don't want the functionality of that tool to generally be public knowledge. So if we're looking for transparency, if we're looking for auditability, if we're looking for the ability to say, this is exactly what is running on our device, I guarantee you that most of the ecosystem providers, all of their incentives are towards making this actually available in a manner that is proprietary, closed, and the only entity they have to be accountable for is that government agency who's going to authorize that it is okay for them to do so. And on the second side, which is your question around council services and how they're exempting their own security services, we actually saw some really amazing work, I think, happen over the course of late last year and early this year, where, for example, in the Netherlands, the intelligence agencies overtly came out and said, the deployment of this technology on all devices is an unacceptable cybersecurity risk to the Netherlands as a nation state. And that's, I believe, the primary motivating factor behind why these exemptions are now starting to come in, saying they don't have to be deployed in your devices. I think that the fact that these technologies, even according to intelligence agencies, people who want these capabilities to exist because they want it to be a slippery slope of, starting with CSAM, tomorrow it'll be terrorism, day after tomorrow it'll be intellectual property, and then pretty soon we are in a place where typing Tiananmen Square will mean that like the CCP in China will automatically know the fact that you've typed Tiananmen Square, and it'll happen because of the fact that you are operating on a device where these capabilities have been built for CSAM scanning in Europe. So there are like global consequences to building these technological capabilities, and especially this idea of reporting back home is something we believe that we should very strongly push back against, because if that ends up being implemented, we would have crossed a threshold from which I don't think we will be able to come back as a society.
Yes, thank you very much for these very important points. I noted down one question from the chat, and I'm not sure whether it would be directed to you. Maybe yes, maybe to Carmela. We'll see. And there was a question if or how they can detect encrypted messages on decentralized wireless off-grid mesh networking outside like the so-called internet. So does somebody want to take this question?
Camilla, do you want to take it?
I think maybe here, Asha, you are actually better. I think that as long as to communicate inside this mesh of grid network, whatever, you are on an app that is subject to the regulation, the app is subject to the regulation, and there is no way around, right? This thing, I mean, if it is encrypted, it would be considered a high risk by the regulation, and then it has to implement this thing. The medium in which the message is transmitted doesn't matter, because this thing happens on the device. Please correct me if my interpretation of the law is wrong. Not a lawyer.
No, I think that you're absolutely right. And I also think the reality is actually going to end up being, if I actually set up a decentralized network just for my 5 friends and we want to be able to send messages to each other, we need to be okay with violating EU law, but then we'll be able to do so, and that's because like there is ostensibly a world in which like I can get a separate device, install my own operating system in it, build my own system, but obviously like most people are not going to do that. But even if you do, it's possible that you will still be able to talk to each other. But 2 things: one, the fact that if you do that, you're violating the law, because you are a high-risk service that is offering encrypted messaging services that is not performing client-side scanning, will create a chilling effect on such technologies existing in the first place. And the second is that a lot of these capabilities are actually present, I believe, at the operating system level, where there are 3 to 4 operating systems in the world that most of us use. There are many other examples of ones that don't necessarily be as widely used, but across Windows, iOS, Android, and Mac OS, I would say it's quite comfortable to say more than 99% of the world's population at some point spends a certain number of hours a day using these technologies. So the natural place for these technologies to be implemented is within the operating system. And once that ends up happening, it doesn't matter whether you're running your own mesh network, because the thing that will be doing the spying on you is something that you need in order to be able to fundamentally access your devices. And that's why these obligations, I personally believe, will actually be enforced. If I'm an agency and I want to enforce this, I'm not going to try to make 5,000 apps try to comply. I'll just make the 4 operating system vendors comply. And if they do, then the capability is present in the application. And then no application can say, I don't want to build it, because the answer will be, it's already in your OS. Why don't you just like call that API, plug it in, and use it?
But just to add to this, because now I saw the question written, kind of the idea seems to be that if you are outside the internet, the scanning does not happen on the internet. The scanning happens on your device. And as Udav said, you need your device to access the internet or the other internet, or to write something on a thing that you send on a pigeon. It doesn't matter. As long as you use your device, you're subject to this regulation.
Absolutely. And just to answer a question that I've also seen right on the top, because I think it's a pretty important one around open source systems. This is definitely a scenario and a situation where I think the nature of open source is such that you can download the code and remove the parts you don't like. So it's very interesting to imagine how you would enforce it in Linux, where even if the Linux Foundation, who maintains the Linux ecosystem, has to include it, there is no way for them to control people going in and disabling that module in the Linux operating system and using it. But the reality is that I think ultimately when enforcement starts, we are actually working towards a world where this means modifying your software becomes illegal. So using VPNs become illegals, because the only way to prevent people from getting around this is, if I'm a bad actor, I'll just be honest with you, I'm not going to use this. I'm not going to go to a store, buy an iOS, create an Apple account with my own name and send CSAM to my friends when chat control is out. I'll just do it in a way by removing these functionalities, and the bad actors will continue doing all of the bad actions that they have, because it's just impossible for you to implement them in practice in a manner where bad actors can't circumvent, while the consequences are actually going to be paid by all of the good people using these devices to do legitimate things in the world, because it's their privacy that will end up being violated and scanned.
Yeah, thank you. Very, very important point. And we are talking about legality a lot, and maybe I would like to move to Asha for the next question or segment, so to say, or that we want to cover. And that is that, even in the European institutions, in Council, their legal services said during an assessment that the proposal as it stands has little chances to survive in a court. And in the Parliament, the topic has also been discussed. We reached similar conclusion that the indiscriminate scanning would be illegal and that there is no chance for the regulation to be lawful. So I want to ask you, Asha, if you can explain to us why the regulation as proposed by the Commission would be unlawful, and which safeguards does it override in our society?
No, absolutely. And if I could just say, I think we're talking a lot about client-side scanning, and it's being presented as this silver bullet that's going to be this privacy respecting methodology to scan for CSAM, but it's fundamentally a contradictory statement in the fact there is no point in which, if you're using an encrypted service, the data is encrypted. So it doesn't function. But you're absolutely right when it comes to the unlawfulness of the proposal. And there's actually several reasons for why it's unlawful, both in EU law and international law. But it is very telling that the legal service of the European Council, so these are the team of lawyers that they send a proposal to check to make sure that they're undermining EU law, went back and told them that this is not a lawful proposal, but they are forging ahead anyway, which tells us much about the kind of political drive behind this rather than the kind of factual legality. So I'll highlight a few main points here. So we've already kind of discussed how the proposal would inherently weaken end-to-end encryption. And more specifically, the proposal says that material should remain detectable in all interpersonal communications through the applications of better technologies. We've already talked about how unreliable that they can be. And in the case of the lack of a consent by a user to be subject to this scanning, the detection mechanism should still be used to access the data in its unencrypted form without compromising the end-to-end encryption once transmitted. So again, this just isn't feasible. It doesn't work. But fundamentally, the biggest thing here is that the European Court of Human Rights categorically confirmed that solutions that weaken encryption and create backdoors to facilitate access by law enforcement authorities to encrypted communications data in the context of criminal investigations violates the right to private life under Article 8 of the European Convention of Human Rights for all users. So we already have established European case law that says that this is unlawful. But another point that I would highlight here is that end-to-end encryption isn't just about privacy protection, right? I think we have to think about how essential it is in a functioning democracy. It's an essential tool for human rights defenders, for journalists, for whistleblowers, and for frontline service providers like domestic violence shelters increasingly use end-to-end encrypted services during the pandemic to be able to get access and information to victims of abuse and to be able to get them to safe spaces. So it's an essential tool of communications, and the European Court of Human Rights has clearly established that it is protected by the convention. But there's another aspect to this, and it actually goes back to something you said earlier, Marketa, in the example that you used when it came to China about kind of court-ordered surveillance. The Danish proposal, the Danish Council's proposal actually even undermines the fact you wouldn't even need a court to issue such an order, which is, just fundamentally undermining the rule of law. So what the proposal actually says is you have these idea of detection orders, which are basically warrantless detection orders that are deployed across entire services. Now, we've talked about whether this will be done at the operating service level or on platforms, but essentially, these would impose systems of mass surveillance. We've talked about the fact that the proposal talks on whether a platform is high risk. If a platform offers or a service offers end-to-end encrypted services, it is automatically designated as high risk or will very likely be designated as high risk. So you have these warrantless detections to be deployed across the whole platform. Now, from a legal perspective, this is an issue of proportionality, right? In order for any surveillance measure to be legal, the measure itself would need to meet the requirements of something called the three-part test. So it needs to be based in law, it needs to pursue a legitimate aim, and it has to be proportionate to that aim. And what this proposal is saying is that entire platforms and all of its users will be surveilled if the platform itself is deemed high risk under the CSAM proposal based on its designation. So this is inherently disproportionate, as it would require scanning private messages and content of users who have no allegations or suspicions of wrongdoing against them. Even more worrying, as I mentioned, is that the current proposal by the member states would allow detection orders to be issued not by a judge, but by a coordinating authority, so not a judicial body, before it goes to a judge or a judicial authority. So this fundamentally undermines the rule of law. Now, thankfully, the European Parliament's version of the text corrected this, and they suggested that we have issue warrants instead of warrants instead of just mass detection orders, and we would highly encourage that this is also adopted elsewhere. But the last thing I will say is about the removal orders, which goes hand in hand with the detection orders. And so there's a risk to fundamental rights here, because once the removal order is issued, a platform has to respond rapidly and usually within 24 hours. So this often, it may seem reasonable from the outset, but what will happen in practicality is the use of the tools that have been mentioned already, these machine learning tools and these other tools, and they will be used and and providers will be placed in a position where they'll have to kind of prioritize rapid enforcement over very careful verification, which would be needed in this case, in creating incentives for those platforms to kind of undermine encryption and increasing the likelihood of overblocking, and particularly in the case of misidentified content. But at the same time, the proposal makes judicial oversight over these removal orders optional rather than mandatory. So again, we're looking at a rule of law issue here. So all of this is to say that the proposal undermines privacy, it's a threat to freedom of expression, and most of all, it's contrary to the numerous European and international legal standards on due process, judicial oversight, proportionality, as well as those fundamental rights risks that we're seeing. And we're being asked to allow this line to be crossed and simply trust that this level of access and mass surveillance will not be abused. It's essentially being asked, we'll look for this thing, but we won't use it for anything else. And it's essential that we think about this and how to bring the proposal in line with the standards that we have set in international law. And we come together to tackle, of course, the horror that is CSAM from a child's rights perspective, from both a protection and a privacy standpoint, when we think about how we want to address this. And so overall for us, the main concern there on the proposal, looking at it from the legal side, is just fundamentally how it undermines not only European and international law standards, but recommendations from the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, the legal services of the European Parliament, the legal services of the European Council, and countless of activists and advocates who have been saying the same thing.
And thank you for that. Thank you for the answer to this. There has been several more questions in the chat that I'm wondering to whom to give them. Of course, at the end, I will also try to divide them, because still I want to give the floor to Joachim. But I will first give one of these questions, because I think they are sort of related to what has just been said. And that is, if this passes, we have just heard that hopefully not, and if yes, then the court will hopefully take it down. But if this passes, who would actually be implementing these functionalities? And I'm actually maybe pointing towards you, Asha, because of course, logically it's the companies, right? But I think that this question is more directed towards, who in the state, because in the end it will not be over the EU, but in the member state. So which entities in the member state would actually be overseeing this implementation, and maybe then the gathering of the data, etc. Because they would need to give some prompts to Signal, to WhatsApp or whatnot, right? So do we know?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and I'm sure some of my colleagues will be able to support me on this in kind of first-hand understanding. But It's very likely, of course, to be law enforcement agencies. These will be, it's up to the member states to be able to establish who those coordinating authorities will be. But I think it's without question that we're looking at law enforcement agencies in this context. And we also have to remember that at the heart of the proposal is the creation of something called the EU Centre. So this will be a kind of centralized place in which all of those national coordinating authorities would have to send the information that they have collected. There would be verification of the technologies done by this EU Centre, and everything would be centralized there, which raises another cybersecurity question about the centralization of all of that information in one place in the EU Centre and who would be responsible for that. But we're very much likely looking at law enforcement authorities and agencies of that kind, national security, the kind of institutions that governments have been giving sweeping exemptions to in recent laws that we've seen, not just only in the CSAM proposal, but in other proposals that we've seen, where we've seen a lot of national security exemptions. But the proposal itself doesn't very clearly define who those authorities are. It is up to the member states, but we have a general sense of who it might be.
Yeah, thank you for answering that. I don't know if somebody wants to add something. Not for now, then I will go to Joachim, who actually managed, I think, to get a lot of people's attention to this topic. As an MEP, I can testify that we had received a massive email campaign, not only MEPs, but also MPs. And in Czech Republic, where I am from, the topic really emerged as one of the main ones. And so even thanks to Fight Chat Control initiative, Czech government was sort of, before its elections, pressured into changing its position to be against. So very good job. It's all due to mobilization from citizens, of course. So I would like to ask you maybe a bit more about how you started this initiative, how it was born, how did you manage to get so many citizens interested, and do you believe that citizen participation can tilt the balance?
Sure, and thank you for the feedback. So I launched the Fight Check Control website after finding myself in a bit of a unique position. I was, and I still am, embarrassed by my government for resurrecting what I believe to be an inherently flawed and harmful legislation. And by virtue of my work and experience, I also understood the far-reaching technical implications of what is actually being proposed. I think we have heard numerous reasons already, so I'll not reiterate those. But when I then wanted to express my concerns about check control, I realized that doing so was not at all straightforward, and I decided to do something about that. I prioritized two things. I wanted to, in layman's term, explain why this is as problematic as it is, and I wanted to lower the barrier for the average citizens to just make their voices heard. I think everyone online here will recognize that the legislative process within the European Union is not really transparent. It's very difficult to understand. And that just makes things difficult. So doing this website, and I think, I developed this and I put it up myself, and very quickly communities began to pick it up. And I think the movement that has spawned, which it did very organically, I think that really is a reflection of something more profound, which is that it speaks to just how uniquely disliked this is across political spectrums among just everyday ordinary people. So in terms of how do we get so many citizens involved, I think there's no real secret here. I think it's a question of breaking down the barrier of actually being able to engage, because as it turns out, people value their right to privacy. And I think the right to privacy itself is also one of those democratic cornerstones of the entire European Union in the first place. So I think it really speaks to people. So with regard to your question of, the importance of citizens' participation, I think you put it very nicely yourself already. I mean, here's the thing. I mean, citizens raising their voice, that is already and has already tilted the balance. I see member states that are in favor who grow more concerned about the increased exposure, the increased dissatisfaction. I see member states opposing, being reaffirmed in that position. And I think more importantly, we also have an opportunity with the countries that are yet to decide. This includes critical countries such as Germany, who, despite saying that they do not wish to break end-to-end encryption, which, I mean, of course, check control does just that. But we've also seen countries that recently begin to express concerns, such as Italy. So I think this is working. I will certainly be doing my part to help, and for instance, making sure that people are able to contact not just the ministers, the members of the European Parliament, but also the national members of Parliament. In Germany, that would be the Bundestag, Italy, etc. I think at the end of the day, I think we have to remember that this legislation would impact everyone in Europe, and it would take away some of our most sacred fundamental rights, and it would take away those rights for good. So I think it's now is exactly the time to raise our voices, because I believe we can still stop this.
Thank you very much, and sort of thank you for bringing us together today. I have written down a couple of more questions from the chat, and I will start with the one that's asking, how sure are we that this data will not end up with private entities like Palantir, etc.? This data, they of course mean the scanned data. So I don't know if somebody wants to, speculate, because we are, of course, reaching the waters of conspiracies, not really conspiracies, but maybe to rephrase it, the question to be less controversial so that everybody is comfortable answering is how safe the data would be from any third parties who want to either buy it or who want to steal it. And I know that, already some of you touched upon it, but maybe if you want to go in this direction of maybe the selling to third parties, maybe with Puff or someone else.
I think my answer would be no different than any other data. It is data, it's on a database, and database can be compromised. In terms of being sold, I would say that it has less likelihood that data that is collected by a private entity, because it's collected by a public entity that at least in Europe, not known to be data brokers, but in any other terms, systems are systems. All of them are equally insecure.
I think if I could just add a quick point here, I think what is also worth reminding people of is that if you collect all of this data in one place, inherently you also create a massive target for malicious actors. So even though the risk of this data being sold is significantly less than in other instances, you also have a much bigger target on your back that necessarily raises other risks.
For sure. And maybe the only thing that I would add to both the answers, which are perfectly right, is that the design and nature of these scanning systems is such that they actually want information about what worked and didn't work in order to make their models more efficient and effective by relying on the data that they're actually scanning. There's a lot of documented evidence of the fact that in a different context, but quite similarly implemented in terms of its privacy risks in a lot of age verification services, especially those that take your photo and tell you if you're above 18 or attempt to estimate if you're 18 based on your algorithmic information. There are vendors, Yoti is an example of one of them, that have written papers about how their detection rates have gotten good and how collecting this information is an essential aspect of training their models and making sure that the accuracy rate keeps increasing as time passes by. And even today, if you look at like a lot of these scans, you'll see that the way that they phrase their terms and conditions and the way that they take your consent always has a "and improve our services" included in it, with the explicit rationale that this information legally can be justified to also train and improve their models. So I think it's obviously a little bit of a question. I don't think we're going to end up in a world where all information that everyone has will necessarily be sent and scanned this way, but definitely a place where, especially where there are close edge cases or a case where people are falsely detected as having this information, which we are quite certain will happen because of the fact that none of these are 100% accurate, that information will actually be used and collated and collected and be used for very dangerous contexts that I think it's important for us to push back against.
If I may add just very briefly on the third party question, and not from the selling of data perspective, but the inherent need of a third party to support the EU Centre. right? The European institutions itself is going to have to rely, at least from our understanding of the proposal, on a third party to help them build the databases that they're going to be able to need to centralize all of this information that's being sent to them by 27 member states, different authorities who are sending them possible flags, correct or not, right? So there's already going to be a third party engaged in this. It's very likely there'll be tenders and calls for that process. So from that angle, we already know there will already have to be external technical expertise in order for these key elements of the proposal to be fulfilled.
Yeah, thank you for answering that. And maybe staying with you, Asha, there was a question if this proposal could also likely fail because of GDPR and incompatibility with that. What do you think?
Absolutely. We've done extensive analyses and briefings on this, and at the heart of the proposal is a very skewed concept of the idea of consent that is not actually in compliance with GDPR from our analysis. At the heart of it is to say that all users will essentially have to consent to buy into this mass scanning, but if they decide not to consent to it, they don't get access to some elements of the service. Now, GDPR is pretty clear that people are able to make informed consent, so a lot of people might not even know they're being subject to this level of mass scanning. But on top of that, there must not be any significant detriment or a detriment to them if they decide not to consent on the sharing of their data in that context. And by saying they're not able to use certain parts of the service, if they do not subject themselves to mass surveillance, essentially, one, that's not a case of informed consent, and two, that's a level of coercive consent in regards to you should just be subject to mass surveillance if you want to use any of these systems. So this is not just about the GDPR. There's an opinion by the European Data Protection Board that also emphasizes this. It gives us a bit more detailed analysis on what informed consent genuinely means, and our assessment and the assessment of many of our civil society partners and other advocates have said the same. This is not only not compliant with standards on privacy and international law, but it is not in compliance with the GDPR either.
Thank you. Good to know. Hopefully the omnibus will not reopen it too much. I want to ask two more questions that I have read within the chat, but also for our listeners and the chat. If you have more questions, please write them now, as I will be not closing my eyes, but closing the reception of questions, so that then we can somehow make a conclusion. So the two more questions that I have noted down is about exemptions. The first question is about another people apart from the from the ones that are working for the state, which is like about companies and their business secrets, or banks, or any professional secrecy, like schools and school accounts, or doctors. Would they exempt? And if not, are they under, are sensitive data potentially in danger? I'm not sure to whom to direct this question, but
I'm happy to take a very quick stab at it, largely because we have actually tried to evaluate it because of the context in which Signal is deployed, which are often in those exact confidential situations, like, lawyers talk to their clients on Signal, journalists talk to their sources on Signal, and things that are like generally protected under law quite strongly. From the way that we understand it, given the context of everything that Asha has just said about how the proposal relies on consent in the first place, right now there are no real ways in which you can claim exemptions on any of these grounds, because the rationale that, at least in our reading of the law, is that you have consented for this to happen in the first place. And it's very hard to say, I am consenting for you to scan my messages, but I'm not consenting for you to violate my doctor-patient confidentiality, which I think showcases the problem of the way consent is being framed in the proposal as a whole. But the way that we look at it, even for the government and the state devices piece, it's going to be really hard, if not impossible, to figure out a way in which we can actually make this happen in a way that is functionally sustainable. Because ultimately, these are capabilities. It's like, I can definitely speak for ourselves. We are not going to make two versions of Signal, one version of Signal that does client-side scanning and another version of Signal that doesn't do client-side scanning. It would negate like the primary promises to our users. And I think that's a risk that many people are going to face, which is, does this mean that if you want to have a truly secure conversation within governments and you're using Signal, you don't do it on Signal anymore because it doesn't support client-side scanning? Or does it mean it does support client-side scanning and you don't do it on Signal anymore? So like, I think that the practical implications of this are the reason most governments still rely on commercially available software is because there are efficiencies of scale and cost in doing so. And at that point, when the software is being deployed in that manner, it's very hard to say like, just like we have age verification, which is anyways like a pretty horrendous idea, we are now going to are we going to be in a world where people will flash their government ID before a screen and it'll determine whether it's a government or not? It's just really hard to say what is government, what is not government, what are abilities in which you can turn this off or on. And the reality is, if intelligence agencies don't want these capabilities, they can currently even disable them if in the ways they do exist in these systems, right? Like Apple has content communication preferences, Google has Google Safety Core. These are all ultimately technologies that on the device tell you if people are sending you unsolicited nude information. So you can go into the settings and enable it. And that means that if someone airdrops you an obnoxious image without your consent, it'll be a little blurred. That capability can be turned on and off even now. So if this, like, I think we're making a much bigger deal about the exemption on the practical implementation side, while ignoring the fact that the reason it is being even proposed is because of the fact that they agree that the risk is so serious that there is many contexts in which devices should not have these capabilities.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. And you also covered partially or mostly the other question that was posed there about how the exempted authorities will do it. Where will they move? It will be like a specialized open source operating system or something. But you sort of said it now. It does not matter how they will do it. There are technological ways already. What matters is the reasoning behind it. Yes, so maybe you mentioned it, and immediately before that even came the question on the age verification. That's a little bit outside of the scope of our discussion today, of course, but we cannot we cannot ignore the fact that there has been proposals like that there has been controversial things going on in Denmark, also in Great Britain. So maybe your opinions, if you want even the whole round, but whoever wants to, on the age verification. If is it similarly dangerous, if it opens a Pandora box of losing privacy and anonymity on the internet. What are your takes?
So I can come in on this and try to contextualize it into broader concerns that I think organizations like CDT and other civil society organizations might have. There are a lot of conversations around age assurance, age verification tools, kind of what do we do in the light of the harms that we're trying to address. And I think many privacy advocates and free expression advocates and child privacy advocates too have warned about our remaining concerns when it comes to age verification. But I did want to link this to the exemptions point as well. We're in this context where we're seeing a lot of different legislations. We've talked about GDPR, we're talking about the CSAM regulation, age verification in different ways, but also the AI Act. And what we are seeing is this kind of push for more access and at the same time, these national security exemptions for these institutions where they're actually pushing for more access and pushing for more data and pushing for more power in that context. And this leads us ultimately to the question of, when you open the Pandora's box, do we trust them to only pull out from the Pandora's box what they're saying they're going to pull out from the Pandora's box once they have access to all of that information? So I think it's when you contextualize it like that, I think many of us have shared concerns across different themes that are emerging, whether this age verification, mass surveillance. We haven't touched on the issue of spyware, which is very tied to encryption as well, encryption in itself too. So we're very concerned on multiple fronts.
I don't know if somebody else wants to share their thoughts. You don't have to, I'm just...
Joachim, would you like to go? Because I know that you also wanted to comment earlier.
Yeah, I can do a quick point here. I think Asha said most things, but I mean, at a very fundamental level, by requiring age verification, you remove any notion of having anonymous communication. That's just the end of that, which I think is problematic in and of itself. I just wanted to make a general point as well, because one thing I see when you look at the responses we have from various MEPs and various politicians is what's the alternative to this? And I think it's maybe worth spending just a little bit of time on that. And from where I'm sitting, we have to also remember that there's no content to distribute if there's no content produced. I would much rather have all of these resources that would be necessary to implement this go towards protecting the children that are in dire need of help, rather than overwhelming investigative work, taking away privacy rights from everyone. So I'd much rather treat the problem at the root cause as opposed to this blanket approach that negatively impacts everyone.
Happy to go very quickly on the age verification piece. We actually at Signal think that a world in which age verification becomes mandatory, and I think we're rapidly moving to a world both within Europe as well as outside, that like most age verification obligations are going to end up being centralized at the App Store level, where people will expect applications to be able to certify what age they are to the App Store by the App Stores verifying the age of the users, so that if you download an app, the app will check with the App Store, is this person above 18 or not, hypothetically. In terms of concentrating the risk of power in these large technology platforms that already have so much private information about you, and then you giving even more private information for them is just net bad for privacy. We also think that it is ultimately deeply flawed as a construct or a concept, because I don't know, I think everyone on this call at some point was 15, right? Were you ever told not to do something, and did you want to do it anyway? Because I can assure you, you did it. And if tomorrow it'll be not doing age verification and getting a VPN to a country where it's not implemented. Day after tomorrow, it'll be VPNs being banned and other ways of being able to access this content also being restricted. I think we're on a one-way street of the eradication of our personal liberties if we start with age verification. And it also ties with client-side scanning in very interesting and important ways, because the unspoken part in client-side scanning is that this is being done to protect children. And I think that the first way client-side scanning will expand as a capability is what are the other things it can scan for people under the age of 18. And those capabilities will be dedicated and predicated upon this age verification taking place. For example, should I be able to scan whether you might be bulimic and you have an eating disorder by the kind of messages you're saying? Should I scan whether you might be at risk of committing suicide? All things that we consider very seriously and take very seriously as a society. But when you start giving younger people fewer rights than older people, it usually ends in a scenario where the young people do the bad things anyway, and the older people end up compromising their fundamental rights in some form. And I think it's a pretty dangerous precedent for us to walk down.
Yeah, thank you very much. I don't know if some last thoughts is also Carmela, just so that we have the whole round.
I think the only thing to add to this is to make a bit of more highlight a point that would have made on the fact that at the end of the day, age verification is going to rely back on the platform. And it's not only a loss of privacy, we have to think about the centralization of power. We're giving more and more power to these entities that are not governments, that are just companies, to be the barrier, to be the deciders of a lot of this thing. And yeah, today is going to be age, but what is going to be tomorrow? Is it going to be gender? Is it going to be sexual orientation? What's it going to be? The moment that we start putting this kind of barriers and we start to give the opportunity to decide about ourselves to a third party, then we're essentially losing a lot of the freedoms that we have, not only as individuals and citizens, but also our government are kind of delegating on technology providers, the rule of law, essentially.
Yeah, thank you so much. I will need to make some closing remarks, but there are 2 questions to which I can answer in 10 seconds. Andra is asking if personal computers will be affected. Yes, it will, if they have the applications that are affected installed. And Robin is asking if it would be also performed retroactively. No, it would not. Legislation, I think, even cannot be used retroactively. And also, of course, the companies would usually not even have the data because they were not forced to scan them and have them. So no. With that being said, I think we answered actually most, or hopefully most, questions. Thank you so much to all the speakers. Thank you for joining for your evening to share with all of our listeners your insights. We have, I think, heard today what we needed. It's that chat control is a dangerous idea. It's unreliable. The technology behind it, of course, undermines encryption. It is unlawful, and it creates more risks than it solves. So with that being said, what I wanted to mention is what happens next. Please stay here with me, because you citizens are actually the most important part of what happens next, as we've seen, thanks to Joachim. On 14th of October, so in a couple of days, 14 days, under Danish presidency, the EU ministers will vote expectedly on the compromise text. And if they adopt it, it will go to trilogues between the Parliament, Council and Commission. And of course, I can promise I will continue pushing for the Parliament's position rejecting the mass scanning. But this is, as we've seen, really about making a difference through the public pressure. So I would just like to ask you to stay engaged. Even these 14 days, definitely, but even after them, if you can still follow initiatives like Fight Chat Control or the Internet Society, who provide, I think, great updates and call to actions. Also, you can, of course, sign up to the Greens IFA Courage Club for updates on our fight in the European Parliament. You can find also all the links in the chat or see QR codes on the screens. Please, before the October meeting, contact your national ministers, usually ministers of interior, and let them know you do not support mass surveillance, and keep spreading the word. I think that together we can stop chat control. So again, thank you once again for being here, to all listeners, to the panelists, to everyone, and have a good evening.